Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode. So today I'm very honored to be joined by a nerd, an evangelist, a content editor. Yes, with me, Dealy from injixo. It's a huge pleasure to have him on the show. Today is going to be about planning and how important planning is and how fail to plan is planning to fail. Let's go. I think it's a good place to start because there is a lot of articles being written about workforce management, about planning, especially when we think about strategically what planning truly entails. I think it's always good to have that perspective on what defines good.
Definitely.
Chris, welcome to our show. Welcome to our podcast. Really excited to have you here. How are you doing today?
I'm great, thanks, Andre. How are you?
I'm doing well. Like I said to you, just we were speaking before we start recording, really energized for today. It's early in the day, but I think it's going to be a really fun conversation.
I mean, the sun is shining for both of us, and
Yeah.
a couple of guys who love the subject, so hopefully we'll have a fun time.
Yeah, and
thanks very much for having me. I'm really flattered to be invited on. I mean, I really love what you guys are doing at WFM. An independent, sort of unbiased, voice of the planet. Really useful and trustworthy source. So really glad to be here.
Thank you for the kind words. And what better way to start than I have two immediate questions. One is in the subject of what we will be speaking. So today we want to cover how failing to plan is planning to fail. So there is a lot to be explored in this sentence. But before we go there, my first question is the question we have been asking a lot is how do you describe workforce management in your own words?
Yeah, well, the first book I read about workforce management was Call Center Management on Fast Forward. I'm sure a lot of listeners will have heard of that book. It's a great book by Brad Cleveland and Julia Mabin. It's still a great resource, and I don't think you can beat the definition that Brad Cleveland came up with in the book. Despite all the new channels and the cloud and so on, the underlying principles are pretty much the same. So the definition I pinch from Brad is, workforce management is about forecasting, staffing, scheduling, and making adjustments in real time when unexpected changes occur. And the objective is to get the right number of people in the right places at the right time. So you don't want, too many or too few people. If you have too many people, that's clearly inefficient. If you've got too few, then you're ruining the customer experience and stressing the agent, which is not what you want.
Yeah, you need to create that environment of working together. I think it's super important. So, like you said, and I think you got a very, I'm not one to call it old, but a definition that relates with a lot of people for over the years. But you have been with this WFM industry for quite some time now. I think you are by far one of the names that pops up every time. If anyone researches on WFM, will be for sure one of the names. How would you rate this evolution of workforce management as an industry to where it is today?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I've been around quite a long time. And I think in terms of, the evolution of the industry and its maturity, the answer to that question does vary dependent on the industry you're talking about. Workforce management's been part of the landscape in contact centers and call centers really since they existed almost. But in other sectors and even other departments of companies that have got call centers and contact centers, knowledge is really not so widespread. It's not really as evolved. So give an example, one of our customers, the truck tire, they've got the usual expected benefits in their contact center, their front office. But this idea of planning was a completely new idea in the back office. And what they've been able to do is to plan the back office people processing things like invoices. And instead of the usual benefits of workforce management, like improved service level or so on, they're actually driving down the number of overdue invoices because they're handling the back office work better. It was a bit of a revelation to them. So it does depend on, what the user group that you're talking about, really.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point and ties quite well with planning because there is a lot of, I think the industry forces a lot on planning for demand only, as your main job is figuring out demand and just getting people available. But the truth is when you go industry to industry, and this varies a lot depending on the sector you are in,
Yeah.
You might be planning for totally different things. And in
Yeah.
the end of the day, the goal of a good planner, and we'll go there in a second, is to actually help the business make the right decision, understand how the business is set up for that moment in time, and
Yeah.
really make strong recommendations. And it's not only that supply and demand. I mean, there is a lot on supply and demand here, but it's not only that. There is much more than that. And I think your example is actually a very good start to that point. Let's go there. So
Hmm.
you wrote very recently a blog article about what does a top performing contact center workforce planner looks like. And
Yes.
we were speaking just before. You can go and read your article. So, but to say, I would love to ask that question. So, in your personal view,
Yeah.
what really defines a good planner?
Yeah, I mean, great question, Andre. And thanks for plugging my blog post recently. If any listeners are interested, just go to blog.injixo.com and search for what does a top performing contact center workforce planner look like. Fairly short and hopefully digestible. But yeah, in the article, I look at some sort of must have and nice to have skills. So there are skills that you need to be successful as a planner, but there are also some personality traits that really are essential to be successful in planning. And one of the things I have to admit is when writing that post, I talked to our consultants at injixo. I mean, most of those people are former really experienced planners that done the job for a living, and so I had some good brains to pick when writing that blog post. But I mean, the must-have skills, and I think you probably guess what these are. I think you've got to be numerate in the job of a planner. It's anybody who says, "Okay, I'm terrible at maths," it's probably not a good sign that you're going to enjoy being a planner for a start. I mean, I've heard it said it's a good planner is an agent who's good with Excel. And that's not necessarily the case, although I know lots of great planners who were former agents that had a bit of an Excel wizardry about them. But that's a good start. I think you need to be generally tech savvy, so to understand how the technology in the contact center works. Not just the workforce management system. Clearly, if you've got a workforce management system or you're using Excel, you need to be proficient with it, but you need to know how the connected kit works as well. And the other must-have skill, I would say, is being a good collaborator, being a good team worker. Because let's face it, the job of a planner isn't an easy one because there are lots of stakeholders that you've got to satisfy. So there's obviously there's customer service in terms of hitting service level. There's the team leaders, the agents, the business. You've got to keep all those plates spinning at the same time, and you don't do that sitting in glorious isolation. You need to collaborate with your colleagues.
And it's funny that I totally agree with the numbers piece and that mentality of, I mean, if you're good with Excel, you are a good planner. That touches on in the article you wrote. You mentioned other skills that are not necessarily the numbers, but there is one that I really like the way you wrote it, because in a way you put it, it's understanding budget process, and there is a lot on the personality, on being empathic and thinking the big picture.
Yes.
My point is, how important are, I remember speaking about another previous guest about soft skills and how important they are as you develop in your career. That becomes more and more important because the numbers say whatever the numbers say, but it's the story that tells that actually sells the what's happening. How do you see that soft skills on the role of a planner, how important they are?
Yeah, well, we touched on one of the. It's not exactly a soft skill, but you do need that analytical mindset. You have an eye for detail and have that analytical background. And in a way, you need to have a little bit of sales skill. In a way, you've got to be persuasive. Sometimes you've got to deliver some bad news to operations, and it may be the classic example, of course, is we simply haven't got enough people. So how are we going to overcome that problem? We need to create a good case for tackling that problem, whether that's hiring or introducing flexible contracts, whatever it is. You have to have some persuasive skills about you.
Do you think that we were speaking about success before, and even in recent episodes? I totally think that a successful career doesn't need to have all steps. Like, I think there is a lot of successful people on certain parts of this industry that are very technical people. They not necessarily need that development of soft skills, but others for sure do. I wanted to pick again on the planning side, because you gave examples on planning for other sectors and industries.
Yes.
One of the things I struggle a lot when I'm speaking with people, let's say people that are not inside workforce management, or they just want to know exactly, hey, what you do, and you try to explain, and then it almost every single time you go to planning and you give practical examples.
Mm.
One of the things I noticed, I don't know if you noticed, and we'll go to plug this back in a second, is many times in your day-to-day life you'll find examples where planning failed.
Yeah.
Like, do you have examples like that? Like, I have two in mind, but I wanted to ask you as well. Like, in your day-to-day life, like completely outside contact centers, completely outside, like where you would normally expect to see a good planning, did you already spot issues like that where you totally see, okay, this is a planning issue they could have sorted if they stopped, or if they looked at the numbers, or tried to do some research to improve this experience or service?
Yeah. I mean, I kind of focus on the contact center workforce management most of the time, but I mean, that motto, to fail to plan is to plan to fail, is one that, well, I certainly live by, and I know that a lot of planners live by that motto. And a really trite example is, my wife and I, we built our own house, not with our own hands. We had a house built, and there are lots of, it's a big project, and you need to plan a lot of things months or even years ahead. And if you don't do that, it's going to be just like it is when you see house building on TV. It all goes horribly wrong. You go over budget. It's late. You end up getting divorced. Thankfully, as far as I know, none of those things happen. But if you don't plan in any sort of big project in your personal life, it is going to fail.
Let me go there, because I'm actually in that process where building a house is so stressful.
Yeah.
You made loads of plans on, okay, this is going to happen on that timing, then after that I'm going to take care of this, and then eventually everything will lay out. There will be any kind of factors that can influence the plan.
Yes.
And one that I found very obvious in construction is materials. You can have a shortage of certain materials that then, if you delay a certain piece on building walls or electricity, it will derail the others, because they already have commitments, and
Yes.
they are not stop just building your own house, so they are doing other stuff. So I think it's a good example on managing that frustration. It's a huge lesson learned. I think it gives you a lot of lessons for your personal life.
Absolutely. One thing I learned with that, Andre, sorry to interrupt, is that it applies to any sort of project. There are three opposing forces. Quite often there are three opposing forces, aren't there? But the three opposing forces are, you can have a cheap project, you can have a quick project, or you can have a high quality project, but you can't have all three. So the mistake we made, and a lesson learned, is we told the builders that we want quality and we're interested in keeping the price under control, but we're not so bothered about time. And tell that to a builder, and they rub their hands with glee, and they fit your job in around all the others. So that was a lesson learned.
Funny story. So just to go back, Chris, to your career, and you have been, I cannot run from this. So you had different job titles over these last few years.
Yeah.
And there is something that I wrote here when I was preparing. Please correct me if I'm saying something totally wrong. Okay. But one of the way I describe it is, you had job titles such as WFM Evangelist, WFM Nerd, and I would love to know more about this one. How do you describe your role? Because being a WFM nerd is something that is totally different. So how do you describe your role today?
I mean, I'm proud to be a nerd, and I'm afraid most of us are at Injixo, and it's because I love the subject. I mean, the listeners can't see this, but I've got a few grey hairs. I've been around call centers almost as long as they've existed. And actually, I'm going to give you my life story. My first job was in operational research, and the company I worked for developed software for simulating manufacturing processes. Now, in the mid-90s, these things called call centers started appearing, and we were approached by quite a number of big companies, like Lloyd's, TSB, and Nationwide Building Society, who were setting up call centers for the first time. And they got us to build pretty accurate digital twins, as they call it, of these call centers, to take the risk out of strategic planning, to basically run the call center before it exists, and answer questions like, how many agents are we likely to need in total? How big does the center need to be? Should we have more than one? That kind of thing. And I tripped over something called workforce management. So obviously simulation modeling is about medium and long range planning. And our customers are saying, well, have you got something to help me, forecast what the volume is going to be next month and to schedule my staff? And I've discovered this category of stuff called workforce management. I thought, that's fantastic. Simulation is great, but with workforce management, you can actually deliver some much more practical inputs and never look back from that. I mean, since then, I've worked with dozens of individual contact centers looking at the goals and challenges. And of course, if workforce management is a fit, making sure they achieve their objectives with it. So that was all sort of one-to-one engagements, dealt with probably must be 100 contact centers over the years. And in marketing, it's always good to have people who actually know what they're talking about, to have some product and industry knowledge within the marketing team. So about 3 years ago, I made the leap from heading up our UK customer-facing team to be the kind of subject matter expert in marketing. And that's why I'm proud to be a nerd. And, marketing is about one-to-many communications. And it's my job to spread the word about some of the wonderful things that it can do for you.
Yeah, I consider myself a nerd, but in the subject, because I really love it. I think both of us would agree. That's something that drives us to speak.
Yes.
So if that defines in that category, I mean, even though my job title doesn't read nerd, but I really like that definition. So by being the nerd, and you mentioned a bit about how it all started.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm starting to notice, and you mentioned this about when you were talking about the numbers.
Yeah.
That there is loads of benefits on having that data-driven approach to planning, because many times we have a feeling planning approach. I don't know if you cross paths with people that, I feel like this will be like that, and they totally disregard the numbers. I mean, there is loads of people that have been in the industry for such a long time that they really have that feeling. But I think it touches on what you were saying. So data-driven approach is definitely important and defines a good planner. Yeah. But I wanted to touch about now with the technology and developments, and now the technologies are pushing us to find new ways of doing things.
Yeah.
How much do you think that these technology enhancements and that data-driven mindset will help to set planning differently? Because I really think it will disrupt how you plan, because there is loads of automation efforts. So what do you see in the near future for planners?
I've come across some sort of peers in the software industry who think basically workforce management, job done. There's not much more we can add. It already does all the forecasting stuff, and it does the scheduling stuff, and it does the real-time management stuff. But actually, I'm going to be a bit controversial. I think it's far from done. I mean, I remember being in a meeting with a colleague demonstrating a software to a prospective customer. And they said, well, there's a forecasting function. Forecasting's forecasting. Do you really want to see it? And yes, of course. And the ways of forecasting, the things you've got to forecast have changed over the years. And that, do you want to see it, was in 2002. And, there's so much more nowadays that, different channels, a different shape to the workforce with, remote and hybrid working, that there's definitely room to improve the functionality. But I think there's also definitely room to improve the usability. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts in a workforce management system. There's no getting away from that. It can't be plug and play. If it was plug and play, it wouldn't do very much. But there's a lot that workforce management vendors can do, I think, to make it easier to get up to speed and to adapt to the changing world.
Yeah. Do you think that this is a tough question to ask? So apologies in advance. But how good do you think that contact centers and all the service providers are, into incorporating those changes for mutual benefit of themselves as well as the employee?
I mean, it does vary tremendously, doesn't it? There are examples of good practice and bad practice, I suppose.
Yeah. So let's focus on the good to avoid going on on a bit less positive road. Yeah. Like, do you have anything that you could share about some best practices that are creating that culture of continuous improvement, kind of self-development, especially on the contact center planning?
Yeah.
And how organizations are ensuring that they're staying up to date with these latest trends?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things I'd like to share there, Andre. The first thing I want to say, though, is I don't really want to be overcritical of planners, because it's a tough job. Mm-hmm. As I said, lots of moving parts, lots of competing stakeholders that you've got to keep happy. So I wouldn't want to be critical people in the planning function, but there are a few sort of recurring themes that we see, things that maybe could be done better or differently. The one thing that sticks out to me is, we're all excited. You and I, I'm sure, Andre, are quite interested in forecasting and the way to forecast different channels over different time periods, and the ways that we're deploying artificial intelligence, things like that, to make the forecasting easier and more accurate. Forecasting is great, but I'm going to say something controversial, and that is that by itself, a forecast has no value. It's what you do with the forecast that matters. So I'd actually say where the magic happens, most of the magic happens with workforce management and planning, is in the scheduling of people to cover the different types of work, the different channels. And one, I won't call it a mistake, but one sort of pattern of behavior we often see is companies start up using workforce management software and they reproduce the shift patterns that they've had for ages. And they're not using the capability of the system to optimize the supply of staff around that variable demand. Obviously, reproducing the shifts you had before is the path of least resistance. It's maybe not a bad idea in the short term, but if you stay on the old shift patterns, you're leaving most of the benefits of the planning process on the table.
That is actually a very good one. I was just writing that down because it's keeping as is, and I think that's a good principle that I saw in the past leading to frustration, which is you have a problem, you find a solution that solves your problem, but then you force on the requirements. But I want this solution to deliver exactly the same as today because I don't want to disrupt how we operate.
Don't scare the horses.
I think I saw that more times than I can count. So very, very interesting. What are things that you believe that are myths about workforce management that over the years you have been trying to debunk and try to get things straight?
Yeah, I think one that sticks out is that, we're talking about real-time management and intraday management, and it's seen quite often as a sort of reactive discipline. We've got a problem, the service level's going right down and there's a massive queue building up and it's sort of panic mode, panic stations. Let's change agent skills on the fly. Let's cancel training and one-to-ones. And actually we did a great webinar about real-time management a year or so ago with Todd Gladden of PlanMen and Rebecca Waterson of Specsavers. If you want to see it, just go to injixo.com/events and search for real-time management. You can watch the video. And basically, good real-time management isn't panic mode. It isn't being completely reactive. It's about having what Todd calls a plan to react. So, a well-run contact center will run sort of war games to create and refine that plan to react. An escalating list of actions that are triggered in a set order, and it's all pre-planned. So you're not panicking. You're doing something that has been planned. So again, to fail to plan is to plan to fail, even in real-time management.
Totally. And I think that's a good example, because then the other part we didn't spoke is that planning entails a wide spectrum in time. So you can be planning for what's happening today or tomorrow. You can be planning for the end of the month or a specific promotional activity, but you actually can be planning to set up a full year budget. And those, I think those axes in terms of when you look at the range in time totally differs as well on the approach, as well as the skills you need to build both plans, because they are, I think that's one of the common, back to the mistakes we spoke briefly. I think this is a common mistake that I see, is that someone that is really, really good at planning in the short term might not be that good in planning for the long term, because the level of abstraction you need to build on your plan, if you are a super technical person, super analytical, it's going to be hard to process. It's really, sometimes you need to confront yourself. Okay, I need to make it simpler, have an assumption that everyone agrees, and even though that number is not perfectly mathematically calculated, it's still important to build that more holistic overview.
Definitely.
So you mentioned how you started your career. So with all the knowledge collected and acquired over the years, if you had to start today, what would be your priorities to develop your personal career?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the first thing I would say is, get to know in detail how the different parts of the workforce management cycle work. Forecasting, you mentioned both long and short range forecasting, because they're different disciplines. You need to understand how that works. You need to look at the staffing calculation, which is nowadays is not going to be Erlang unless you're talking about calls. You need to approach the staffing thing differently for different channels, and so on. Get to know the whole cycle. We did recorded of our webinars. If you go to injixo.com/events, you'll see videos about each stage in the workforce management cycle with some industry thought leaders. I learned something from every single one of those, even though I've been around for a few years. And so get to know how it actually works. And the second thing I'd say is don't forget about the people side. Workforce management is central to the job of the planner, but at the end of the day, the planner is measured by the outcomes that workforce management delivers. But don't forget, it has an impact on lots of people. Starting with the agents, of course. Let's face it, being an agent, has its ups and its downs. The least we can do in planning is to do what we can do to reduce stress. Doing things like having reasonable occupancy goals, taking account of working time preferences as far as we can, and building shifts that avoid understaffing, which is stressful.
Do you think today is a good time to start a career in workforce management?
I would say definitely yes. I mean, the need to use maths to improve business outcomes is not going to go away. And even if the role of the planner develops over time, which it certainly will, those core skills are always going to be needed. So I would say 100% yes.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the only caveat to the answer you just said, which I totally agree, is probably the skill set you need today is different from what it used to be.
Yeah.
Which I think it's totally amazing because it shows the resilience on this industry evolving and developing professionals.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very good sign. But I agree with you. It's totally I think it's probably one of the best times. If recent past teached us anything, and I will speak about one that it's a topic that was in our minds for a few years, which is with COVID planning. The vaccinations, everything had loads of efforts on the planning side. Like WFM professionals that I spoke that were seeing from the outside, especially when there were supply constraints or whatever constraints were, they totally understood okay, what's the plan behind it? I remember people forecasting things and trying to, okay, how do we improve this plan? How would we do it differently? And that showcases the value of having a strong background on planning. Workforce planning totally can solve these issues in our recent past.
Definitely. And, we're living through this perma crisis, I've heard it described as. We've had the pandemic, we've had mega inflation, got war in Europe, who knows what's next. So having the planner mindset and having that motto, to fail to plan is to plan to fail, is always going to be needed. Just one other point I'd make, Andre, is that there's a lot of talk about AI doing people out of a job, and all the workforce management tools have got automated forecasting using machine learning principles, things like that. And I've heard people say that if this thing becomes completely automatic, is there going to be the need to have a human being involved? And the answer is fundamentally, absolutely yes. Because just not understanding the numbers going in and not understanding the numbers coming out is a recipe for disaster. Let's say that you've had the workload, the manual workload involved in producing a forecast cut down. You're not going to just, watch TV or something with the time freed up. You can use it to actually do more of that planning stuff and actually interact with your colleagues, like marketing, for example, to anticipate stuff that the algorithms will never anticipate, like an advertising campaign or something. So, it's not going to do anybody out of a job, I don't believe.
In the end of the day, there is that, how do I call it, that human decision making, that no matter how mathematical the decisions are, sometimes there are gray areas that you need someone to step in and make that call in the end of the day. So, Chris, you had a tremendous career. I mean, you are definitely someone that speaks and is passionate about this industry. Who inspired you throughout your career?
Yeah, I mean, I've had the good fortune to have worked with some great people over the years. And my first boss, a guy called Brian Hollocks, he was the leader of an operational research team in a nationalized industry. And he took our software and a small band that developed it on a journey into the private sector. And he taught me not to fear the unknown. And he also taught me, maths and computers can actually be exciting. And that was an exciting period. Else that's been an influence is René Nyman of Conduit. And I think you've had him on the podcast before. He was a customer of mine, and René's a pretty impressive guy. And he taught me that planning really is a profession, and you should be proud to be a nerd. And I absolutely live by that. So thanks to René for that. Somebody, I don't know if you ever come across Graham Gabriel. Graham and I worked together a couple of times over the years. Mm-hmm. He's another workforce management nerd. And he taught me the importance. I mean, he's from Liverpool, and he taught me the importance of having a sense of humour and again, not forget the human side. Workforce management isn't just about numbers, it's about people. And the final one I mention is Peter Bollenbeck at Envision. Envision is the company behind injixo. Mm-hmm. Now, Peter hired me in 2005, 17 years ago. Can you believe it's 17 years? I mean, back then we were just setting up in the UK, and we've really grown over the years, and I'm proud of what we've achieved. But the culture and success of any company comes from the top. And Peter's a real polymath, much cleverer than me. He's one of those annoying people that's great at everything he does. And he taught me, among other things, to dare to be different. I mean, when I joined, we didn't have any customers. Nobody'd heard of us. And you had to dare to be different to get on in a situation like that. And he also taught me the importance of making decisions based on facts and evidence, not just on gut feeling. I mean, there's a role for gut feeling, but you need to be a bit more scientific sometimes. So those are the people that have inspired me.
You mentioned something that is very important, which is that cultural, like there is always someone from the guests that I have been speaking that had very successful careers, where there is always someone that creates that awareness and ambition in your personal self on self-development. That is a very common pattern. And back to the careers, and sorry to hijack a bit your answer.
Okay.
Many times it's important to have someone that mentors you. So for anyone listening, that if they are struggling to do the next step, try to find someone that can mentor you. Try to get someone that experienced the same issues before, because having someone that can be that anchor for you, I think will do wonders for your personal development.
I couldn't agree more, Andre. I mean, really, the thing I didn't mention about those people that I've dealt with over the years that have influenced me, inspired me, is that they were always willing to discuss things and give advice, let me bounce ideas off them. And having somebody like that to help you on the journey is absolutely vital.
I wanted to ask you, if you had to start or to solve a problem for our industry, what would it be, under the premises that there is no budget limitations, time or resources, so you could fix everything you want? So what would you aim for? What would you fix for the community?
I think the number one thing, I mean, I've got a few ideas, but you probably don't want to hear all of them. But the number one thing is that, planning, as we're both agreed during the podcast today, has a huge impact on outcomes, and it deserves a seat at the top table. It shouldn't be an afterthought. So when the business is planning for the future, then the planning team needs to be involved in that process as well. So the old chestnut is that marketing comes up with a new campaign, and the first thing the contact center knows about it is that the phones are ringing off the hook and the queues escalating because nobody told us. And that's because sometimes the contact center and the planning function in particular is thought of as an afterthought. We really should and deserve a seat at that table.
Super valid. Chris, any final words to our listeners before we wrap up?
I would say I'm proud to be a workforce management nerd. My colleagues here are proud to be workforce management nerds. Be proud to be a nerd.
What a way to end. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today. It was a pleasure having you with us today, and speak to you soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Andre. All the best.